Hey guys, it's Bella, and we are back with History Debunked to read through chapter 2 of An Introduction to Critical Race Theory. So I've got my annotated version here. Simon, before we go into it, any sort of, I guess, overall thoughts from this chapter, perhaps, that you've had?
Well, the main thought is, are you familiar with Marxism and Marxist philosophy? Because otherwise that chapter is going to be more or less meaningless.
Yeah, so certainly I think the emphasis on materialism is not explained well enough.
Yeah, and idealism too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting especially a sense from this chapter because the first chapter was rather introductory. The lawyerly nature of this chapter is coming through a lot more, and the focus on legal matters. Because, like they said in the first chapter, critical race theory has since started applying to other aspects of study, and that's where I'm familiar with it from literature and from history. And obviously, in those areas, it's going to focus on different things rather than racial disparities in law. And so I'm realizing how much this book is targeted towards, university law students. And maybe they have these things explained to them along the way, but it would certainly be good, I think, to have a small thing explaining materialism for people. But we will go in then for the time being. They start off with another one of these italicized hypothetical scenarios to get you thinking about these matters on the level of individuals. I found this a curious exercise. I'll quickly read through it for the benefit of the audience. It says, imagine that a pair of businessmen pass a beggar on a busy downtown street. One says something disparaging about those bums always sticking their hands out. I wish they would get a job. His friend takes him to the task for his display of classism. He explains that the street person may have overheard the remark and had his feelings hurt. He points out that we should all strive to purge ourselves of racism, classism, and sexism, that thoughts have consequences, and that how you speak makes a difference. The first businessman mutters something about political correctness and makes a mental note not to let his true feelings show in front of his friend again. Is the beggar any better off? That's an interesting question. I'm curious, what do you think, Simon? Is the beggar better off?
That, yeah, um, the problem comes in the second part, really. The idea that if you could abolish classism or abolish racism, which is an aim that most people have, most people feel that if you could abolish this classism, your prejudice against beggars and so on, that that would be a good thing and that society would be improved. Delgado doesn't think that for a moment. He doesn't think that just abolishing racism or curing people of racial prejudice would be a good thing, would be an end in itself. He's more concerned with changing society.
To be sure, and that's the materialism that we'll get onto below. So let's just then read the second part. Or imagine that a task force of highly advanced extraterrestrials land on Earth and approach the nearest human being they can find who happens to be a street person, relaxing on a park bench. They offer him any one of three magic potions. The first is a pill that will rid the world of sexism, demeaning misogynist attitudes towards women. The second is a pill that will cure racism. The third, one that will cure classism, negative attitudes towards people of lower socioeconomic station than oneself. Introduced into the planet's water system, each pill will cure one of these three scourges effectively and permanently. The street person, of course, uses classism and throws pill number 3 into a nearby water department reservoir. So, will the lives of poor people like him improve very much the next day? Perhaps not. See, I find this bit curious here. So passers-by may be somewhat kinder, smile at them more often. But if something inherent in the nature of our capitalist system ineluctably reduces poverty and class segregation, that system will continue to create and chew up victims, irrespective of our attitudes towards them. And this is true. I mean, my reading of it, when people say to get rid of sexism, racism, classism, I assumed that it would include, along with getting rid of these attitudes, that these because people no longer had those attitudes, they might start working to change institutions. Although I think I can see the argument on the level that unless an actual change in wealth comes about or a change in goods, even if people have very nice attitudes, there are still going to be disadvantages. This is the case in a lot of academia, where a lot of academics themselves are very progressive and open to ideas like decolonizing curricula and to promoting minority academics. But it doesn't change the fact that a lot of white male middle class academics have advantages that still aren't going away because the attitudes of people doing academia have changed. So I think that's their point here, is that the material conditions of people are important. They make the same point with racism here below. So, like, what about racism? Suppose a magic pill like the one mentioned above were invented, one so effective that it would completely eliminate unkind thoughts, stereotypes, and misimpressions harbored by its participants towards persons of other races. The president's civil rights advisor prevails on all the nation's teachers to introduce it to every K to 12 classroom and on the major television networks and cable news shows to show it on prime time. So if one could do all of this and end people's prejudices, would life change very much, improve very much for people of colour? And I think we're getting at no, or that was the thing I got from you, Simon, wasn't it?
Yeah, he thinks no, it wouldn't. That's certainly what the author thinks.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, and how would you answer that question?
It's really difficult because I don't want to start going on and using Marxist terminology. Um, it, the popular view that most people have is an idealist view. I don't mean idealist as in the sense that, the good sense that they are idealists, they have ideals. The popular view is one that ideas arise and can change things. So the average person thinks that something like racism is an idea operating in society, just as feminism is, or anti-racism, and that those ideas can change society. From a Marxist viewpoint, from a materialist viewpoint, it's quite the opposite. The ideas themselves are produced by the structure of society, by the economic situation, the base, as the Marxists call it. So it's not the case. In your particular case, you have ideas, for example, about feminism and trans rights and things like that. They're not objective things. They're not things in themselves. They're ideas that have come about because you were born in the 1990s in a particular type of society. So your ideas have arisen from the economic structure of society.
To be sure.
So they can't alter anything. What can alter thoughts, what can alter the way things are, is by altering society. Then different ideas will arise as a matter of routine.
I don't understand what you mean by this.
Okay, if you take an idea like democracy, we tend to think of it as happening that people thought up an idea called democracy, and then that idea itself was used to change things. We might have started with an absolutist monarch who ruled everybody, was a tyrant. Some people came up with the idea that the people should have a say in things, and that idea worked to change society. It was used, the idea itself was adopted by people and used to affect society. Marxists feel the opposite is true, that it's society itself that dictates what ideas should arise. So the ideas aren't floating down from some transcendental Platonic realm. The ideas themselves that we have are produced by our economic condition and the state of society.
Yes, so this would be the idea of like ideological state apparatuses and the role that education and these various institutions with classist motives how they can influence cultural ideas. I don't know if like all Marxists would necessarily agree that these ideas just cannot come about within a classist system, because I mean, Karl Marx himself is maybe a counterexample to that, right? He came up with the idea of Marxism, communism, despite being within a capitalist system and despite being quite wealthy comparatively within a capitalist system. Like he
No,
was.
his ideas were produced. He was a product of society, of an economic condition, and so his ideas were also produced by those same economic circumstances. That is the materialist view. It wasn't that
Yeah.
Marx was sitting at home one day and dreamed up the idea of communism or anything of that sort. The very idea was produced by society. It was produced by the Industrial Revolution.
Right. So with feminism and with like say trans theory, how are these not also a reaction to society? I'm a bit
Because they're
confused on that.
produced by society. All those ideas come about because of the economic conditions that people live in, because of the way that society is structured. it isn't the case that these ideas have risen in people's minds and are then used to change society.
Well, I would say that feminism, even Marxism, have like had quite profound influences on society, have they not?
Yes, in a dialectical sense, because the ideas themselves, but any society brings forth its own contradictions. So, in that sense, yes, feminism was brought forth by society and it's a contradiction to the prevailing idea, which you could call patriarchy. It's thesis, antithesis, and from those, a synthesis will emerge. That is the dialectical process, the dialectical process of history. But anyway, let's move on.
Yeah,
We don't
because
want to be on about Marxism, obvious.
they sort of bring that idea into play actually in this
Mm.
section here. So this is a good way to introduce with the hypothetical question they outlined above two like broad camps within critical race legal
Mm.
theorists. So one camp, which they call idealists, hold that racism and discrimination are matters of thinking, mental categorization, attitude, and discourse. So race is a social construction, not a biological reality, they reason. Hence, we may unmake it and deprive it of much of its sting by changing the systems of images, words, attitude, unconscious feelings, scripts, and social teachings by which we convey to one another that certain people are less intelligent, reliable, hardworking, virtuous, and American than others. We can tell that it's not made for a British audience. A contrasting school, the realists or economic determinists, hold that though attitudes and words are important, racism is much more than a collection of unfavorable impressions of members of other groups. For realists, racism is a means by which society allocates privilege and status. I would actually highlight this more here because I think that's the key thing is people with this more realist or a more materialist approach certainly wouldn't, I think, say that none of this stuff is racism or none of this stuff is a problem. But I think they would say, like we've been saying, that the actual financial, material, like living circumstances of people are not going to change overnight because those above factors change overnight. So realists claim that racial hierarchies determine who gets tangible benefits, including the best jobs, the best schools, and invitations to parties in people's homes. I didn't love that one because that's a very, I guess, inconsequential one comparatively. Members of this school of thought point out that I put a note for this, that anti-black prejudice sprang up with slavery and capitalists' need for labor. Now, I've heard this Marxist take, but like I really don't think it's true. As somebody who studies England and just European history from before the modern era, is definitely not true. They definitely had anti-black prejudice, and much of it seems to have come in with hagiographic literature and with the church really, because in early medieval England, before you get priests coming in from other parts of the world, England is fairly isolated. They may not have known before the church came about the existence of people with black skin. But when the church came and they brought texts with them from the Mediterranean, they have these stories, such as we see, for instance, in the Lives of the Fathers, which is a collection of monastic stories. We see the black demonic figure, the hypersexualized black person, which merges into this like demon within the Christian mythology to taunt and to tempt monastics. This enters into English literature, whether Anglo-Latin or Old English literature, and that sort of becomes that's certainly a very prejudiced attitude. They certainly did not have a positive view of these black-skinned individuals, and black skin in Old English literature
But that's to
oftentimes.
do more with the curse of Ham. Noah's son, Ham. In Hebrew, Ham means
Mhm.
hot. And the idea was that, that the children of Canaan would be hewers of wood and carriers of water. So it's not just a demonic thing. It was actually the curse of Ham. Ham's descendants, who were held to be the Kushi, the Africans, were automatically destined to be servants of the children of Shem.
Yes, to be sure. The matter of like whether they were meant to be servants, I don't know if I've seen that in the Old English, in the literature of the Old English period. So it's possible that that biblical explanation was, I don't know, reinvigorated during the period of slavery. And this is, I guess, an important point to bring up, just because that anti-black prejudice within Western societies didn't start with slavery and capitalism. It can certainly, I think, be the case that these prejudices were reinvigorated when it came to slavery, and also that they were changed in what they actually meant. Like as an example, the black demonic figure in Old English is called a seal herawa, which sort of means, it's the translation for Ethiopian, but it also means like any black person. The seal herawa are not, they're not sort of inferior or stupid. They can be cunning and devious and dangerous, which are different to some of these stereotypes of black people that were abounding in Northern America during the era of slavery to justify keeping black people as slaves. So it's possible that when they say sprang up, well, I would say it's wrong what they said here about sprang up, because it implies that anti-black prejudice was invented for the purpose of slavery. But you know, we can certainly bear in mind that anti-black prejudice not only probably got more invigorated during slavery, but the specific claims of anti-black rhetoric probably changed during slavery. It's not an era I know as well, so I can't comment so much on it, but I think it's reasonable to assume that. And here's the second one. Before then, educated Europeans held a generally positive attitude towards Africans, recognizing that African civilizations were highly advanced with vast libraries and centers of learning.
Yes, I'm puzzled about that. Is he talking about Alexandria? I mean, are we talking about Egypt or sub-Saharan African or what?
I don't know, if I'm being honest. I mean, certainly Alexandria, Egypt.
Yeah, but
These
they
were
were
centers of
Greeks. They were Europeans. He's contrasting this with Europe. He says,
learning.
pioneered mathematics long before Europeans had such knowledge of these disciplines. But I mean, Alexandria was run by Greeks. It was run by Europeans.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, this is a bit of a flaw in it. I mean, the people of there may have been involvement to some degree of local Egyptian people within the educational spheres in North Africa, but you're right in that it's a bit of a misleading point. I have a suspicion that they're, especially with centers of learning, I feel like they're referring to Moorish education. So maybe they're referring to like the Muslim university at Cairo, that was founded in the 9th century, I think.
Mm-mm.
So that might be what they're referring to
That's possible,
with
yeah.
that, yeah. Which I mean, even if they were saying that, it would be worth pointing out, obviously, that Arab and Islamic sort of learning and science was over a vast area, not just in Africa, but also parts of Asia
Yeah,
and Europe.
they're playing very fast and loose with that term African. I've noticed this before. Someone will start talking about, oh, Africans did this, Africa, this happened in Africa. And to most people, when they see the word Africans, they think automatically sub-Saharan Africans, the typical Bantu black people. But in this case, you think that they're referring to Arabs or
Yeah, I
Berbers.
mean, well, there's simply put, there's better examples they could bring up, I think, of
Yeah, I
Africans.
think so.
I mean, Ethiopia, Greater Zimbabwe had like big cities. The Swahili kingdoms used to be quite, powerful before Europeans and the
Swahili
Arabs.
kingdoms were Arab. Swahili is a version of Arab. They used to call it Coast Arabic. I can understand some Swahili because it is based on Arabic.
Wait, is I thought Swahili was a Bantu language.
And it's heavily based on Arabic as well.
Oh
It
yeah, to
grew
be
up
sure.
as the lingua franca of East Africa because of the slave trade, the Arab slave trade.
Yeah, to be sure. And
It was
after,
centered at Zanzibar.
yeah, I mean, because when I remember reading about it, it was before the Arabs took them over. They had a culture of their own, and they had sort of they were quite, I don't, I'm only use civilized here in quotations. They had cities and they had international trade and such. But you're right, to be sure that.
I don't know anything about any cities. Great Zimbabwe, they were living in grass huts. There were certainly dry stone walls, the sort of things you might see in the Lake District of England. The people didn't live in stone buildings, they lived in huts round about them. I'm not sure about, we'd need to think a little bit more about cities in East Africa at that time.
Hmm. So according to again, this is a Wikipedia article because I read a bit about the Swahili kingdoms in undergrad. It says that more recent opinions believe that the medieval Swahili coastal sites developed locally with the creation of small agricultural and fishing communities that gave rise to the Swahili culture through trade, which resulted in an increase in Islamic influence during the 12th century. Increased contact with the Islamic world then led to the integration of local African and Arab traditions, creating an indigenous Swahili culture. So,
Yes,
certainly,
but they didn't have any writing before the Arabs arrived. Swahili was
yeah,
they
yeah.
used the Arabic language, the Arabic alphabet.
Yeah, but this is one of the points which archaeologists have been contesting recently, that this idea that writing is so essential for like civilization in the way that we know it. And I mean, I find it a weird argument in general, however, because when we have these discussions of like, do you need writing to be a civilization or a real civilization? I feel like we are on some subconscious level thinking about it in terms of achievement, right? Of one society achieving something better in this weird, like, objective scale. We
No,
almost say,
they specifically mentioned vast libraries. How can you
yeah,
have a
well,
vast library without writing? I don't
no,
understand.
no, no. I'm not contesting that. I'm agreeing with you that this paragraph is misleading. I'm saying that, like, I was talking more generally about archaeological attitudes to how we talk about civilizations and cities and urban living and stuff like this. Like that, I think people used to think that you couldn't have a city without writing, but there have been, of course, settlements which function exactly as we consider cities to function, which didn't have writing. The Indus Valley, I know that they are debated as to whether or not they had a script, but many also North and South American civilizations, like the Olmec,
The
may or may
Olmec
not have had writing.
had writing from the 9th century onwards.
I thought it was contested as to whether or not it's actually
Not
writing.
it's not contested since about the year 2003, when
Okay,
the stuff was unearthed. If you look up Olmec script,
right. Okay, that's interesting. Well, I mean, hang on, the Inca as well, though. I believe they didn't have writing, right?
they didn't know. They used Kipu. They used
Those,
knotted scrolls
yeah, those
but they
amazing.
the mnemonic aid.
Yeah, yeah. Those things are really cool to look at. It's really awesome when you see them surviving in museums.
Yeah,
But yeah, no, I just think it's an interesting thing to bear in mind that we often have these conversations in archaeology about what defines a civilization and what you need to be. And I find it curious when we do. I think we oftentimes we don't say that we are holding ourselves and all of the world civilizations to some sort of objective standard. But at the same time, we sort of talk about it in that way. We talk about, I feel like part of our motive, and maybe this is pure speculation on my part, but I feel like part of our motive in talking about this is almost like this idea that achieving civilization is a grand thing. Like, and so if a civilization if a culture can be shown to have more of the traits associated with civilizations, then we regard that as somewhat of an achievement or impressive, and the people who have descended from that culture we regard maybe more highly. When that's obviously not the case, when sort of people's social organization is just an adaptation to what's going to best help them meet needs of their environment, for the most part. But anyway, they mention the Reader School, and they talk about materialists, and maybe they're going to explain what materialism is. Materialists point out that conquering nations universally demonize their subjects to feel better about exploiting them. This, I think, is fairly uncontroversial. We English certainly did that with the Irish and with the Welsh. Yes, rather monstrously. So for materialists, understanding the ebb and flow of racial progress and intention requires a careful look at conditions prevailing in different times of history. Circumstances change so that one group finds it possible to seize advantage or to exploit another. They do so and then form appropriate collective attitudes to rationalize what was done. So this one. I go on.
I was going to say we can think here of Kipling's poem "The White Man's Burden," which is precisely that epitomizes this. It was written after the Americans occupied the Philippines, and you probably know something of the poem. Take up the white man's burden. The gist of it is that white people were doing a good thing. They were helping the people of the Philippines. The British were helping the people of Africa to rise and become civilized. The whole thing was portrayed as an altruistic enterprise. Both the Americans' manifest destiny and the British driving south into Africa the idea is we were doing it for their own good, to help them, to lift them up to our level.
Yes, it's one of those awfully convenient things that what lifts them up to our level just so happens to enrich
Coincide
the
with
people.
economic advantage for us. These first.
Yes, yes, indeed. Rather cynically. Moreover, what is true for subordination minorities, this is something I find interesting, is also true for its relief. So civil rights gains for communities of color coincides with the dictates of white self-interest. Little happens out of altruism alone. See, I feel like this does contradict what they're saying earlier and even in the first chapter, because I think they're right in saying that racism tends to benefit the privileged. But then they're saying here that civil rights gains, like against the racist system, benefit white people as well. The only way I can see this making sense is if the argument is that in response to protest, it's better to give these civil rights gains than to face the, say, boycotting or backlash that's going to happen if one doesn't. And that's how it benefits white
Yes, you
self-interest.
can think of South Africa. The boycott movement there and the general hatred of apartheid wasn't very good for South Africa. America was looked upon very, very unfavorably in the 1950s and 1960s because of segregation. And so desegregating schools and introducing the civil rights legislation of 64 made America look better. It was done for the interest of the ruling class in America.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I think that does, if anything, that's, I think, an optimistic message because it shows that, going out into the streets, protesting, to even having conversations about racial issues or just any minority groups' issues, they can essentially tip the scale and make it more advantageous for those who hold power to actually do the right thing. And I think they say exactly what you were saying earlier. There, exactly by. Wait, no, that's about the Civil War. It would yes, if it would ill serve the U.S. interest if the world press continued to carry stories of lynchings, clan violence, and racist sheriffs, so that the interests of whites and black for a brief moment converged. I actually, on a related, I'm just checking if there's anything we ought to cover here that's very important. This is exactly what we talked about, but this one I found very interesting. The argument about how attitudes changed after the Korean War when African American people had, experienced a more egalitarian life in the army, and then they come home to an unequal society and they fight back against it. I don't know much about the specific history of that, but that sounds like a very interesting claim. I've heard a similar thing about I've heard a claim, and I've not seen the substantiation. Hands up.
About the British, do you mean, during the World Wars?
No, I was going to say about leather culture and BDSM within the gay community because I've heard that that came out of American war veterans who sort of uh, wanted to bring that like military kind of discipline, and it for some various reasons leaked into their sort of sexual lives, which to me is really fascinating if that's the case.
Really interesting. Yeah.
I'd be fascinated, whoever promulgated that theory. I'd be curious to see if that happened for the straight soldiers who came back, or there's loads of questions I have about that. But yeah, so Bell's article for outrage and accusations of skepticism. So this is an interesting. I mean, this here is an argument about like saying that the when the Justice Department intervened on the side of the NAACP for the first time in a major school desegregation case, I'm assuming they're referring to Brown versus the board. It was responding to a flood of secret cables and memos outlining the United States' interest in improving its image in the eyes of the third world, which is a really, I mean, if that's true, because it's a claim about secret messages, I can't know, but if that's true, that's very interesting.
Yeah, maybe we ought to mention for people watching this that the NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. Not
Yes,
everyone knows that.
yes, to be sure. And during the American Civil Rights era, they were pushing really hard to,
Mm.
and they were providing things like legal support to cases like Brown versus the Board of Education, which officially desegregated schools. So yes, since Bell first found interest convergence, I should highlight that because that's I think that's literally just what they were talking about earlier, that change tends to happen when the interests of minority and majority groups coincide. in a happy coincidence. I think that's all that they mean here by interest convergence. Critical race theorists have applied it to understand many of the twists and turns of minority legal history, including that of Latinos. Yeah, interesting. Others have sought to apply it to the current world situation as the United States struggles to strengthen the hand of moderate Islam via its more fundamentalist faction. That's interesting. I'm assuming this is implying that the US government looks better if it's seen to be combating racism, because that can appeal to moderate Muslims who might otherwise be put off from joining or collaborating with the US perhaps in the Middle East. Again, that's not my area of great expertise. They had an interesting quote by Barack Obama there about America's position in the world. But we'll move on to revisionist history, which, yay, history. So, revisionist history re-examines America's historical record, replacing comforting majoritarian interpretations of events with one that square more accurately with minorities' experiences. It also offers evidence, sometimes suppressed in that very record, to support those new interpretations. Revisionist historians often strive to unearth little-known chapters of racial struggle, sometimes in ways that reinforce current reform efforts. I often think that the word revisionist is applied unfairly to history, because most history should be a process of revising. You know, we're trying to update history to be more accurate with what we know now, as opposed to what we got wrong in the past. But yeah, I think it gets a bad rap, revisionism. Revisionism is often materialist in thrust, holding that to understand the zigs and zags, interesting phrase, of Black, Latino, and Asian fortunes, one must look to matters like profit, labor supply, international relations, and the interest of elite whites. So I think nothing too controversial here. It makes a lot of sense so far. Feel free if you feel so.
No,
Yeah. The difference between the materialists is no minor matter. So if the materialists, what they're essentially saying is that if the materialists are right, the changes needed are much more drastic. They're literally sort of financial. There's a quote by Martin Luther King to the effect that, to repay the literal economic debt of slavery, of all of the lost wages from slavery compounded with interest, etc., it would bankrupt the US. That's, in theory, if we were to go by the fully materialist reparations outcome, that would just be impossible. Whereas if one is an idealist, there are the steps which are already being taken are either enough or will eventually be enough, like legal civil rights cases, victories, things like, speech codes and diverse representation is enough, according to a more idealist perspective. But they acknowledge that there can be a middle ground also. I actually quite liked this quote that they gave here in citing from a legal case, because I feel that oftentimes when people talk about racial insults and microaggressions, people don't talk about it in the context of history and also of just proportions. So they say racial insults are different qualitatively because they conjure up the entire history of racial discrimination in this country. And I'm going to bring a bit of standpoint epistemology here and say that this is something that I can't speak to as well. I genuinely can't say the extent to which the experience of hearing a racial insult massively impacts a minority person as opposed to a white person. I mean, I'm not a white person, but I've not really had racial insults levied against me, so I'm not familiar with it. But in some of the people that they're talking about in the civil rights cases below definitely have, and I can't understand personally how that's like, but I can try to listen to what people are saying and say, well, if they're saying it impacts them this much, let's see what they can do about it. But my point is that we often talk about it in the context of, putting up with it, or I've put up with insults in the past. And I think that's the issue, is people regard an insult against their character, like someone calling them stupid, with a racial insult. And I'm sure there's a specific insult for a stupid Black person, so just insert that. Hearing that is going to be so different, I think, than being told that one is stupid. And I don't like when people tell minorities to just or accuse them of being sensitive, because even if they are being sensitive to it, I would ask the question of why is it that minorities should be expected to put up with more insults than non-minority people?
Yeah, but racial insults are in a different category. If I call someone a goddamn liar, I'm saying they are doing something which they can stop doing.
Mm.
They are telling lies. So if they stop telling lies, my insult dies. If I call somebody by a pejorative name due to their ethnicity, that's a different thing. Now I'm talking about what they are. They can never change. If I call someone, oh, you dirty Jew, right, nobody can do anything about being a Jew. So I'm automatically saying something which they can't do anything about. It defines them, my insult.
To be sure, yeah, and that must feel like absolutely horrible to have people constantly throwing that at you. So let's go on to section C, which may be a bit controversial, the critique of liberalism. So they say here, many liberals believe in color blindness and neutral principles of law, and some critical race scholars disagree with that. So liberals believe in equality, especially equal treatment for all persons, regardless of their different histories or current situations. Some even managed to convince themselves that with the election of Barack Obama, we arrived at a post-racial stage of social development. I had an experience like this in secondary school where in a politics A-level assignment, we were meant to list the factors that make it easier or harder to become president in the US. And I said being white makes it easier. And she crossed that out and wrote, not now, Obama. I'm like, come on. I've always found that amazing that people can, if it's a sincere, if they can actually believe that now that one black person has been elected president, like there's no sudden. So there was difficulty up until Obama got elected, and then nothing. Like now that's completely like just as easy for a black person to get
But
elected
it's
as
a
well.
fantastic payoff for white people in believing that. That really makes you feel good about yourself. It makes you feel good about society because your society is so wonderful that even a black man can become president, and it means you don't have to worry about racism, racial prejudice anymore. No, it's a win-win situation for white people adopting that attitude.
Yeah, to be sure. And I think also then they get to turn around to anyone who's still complaining about racial issues and say, you know, why are you complaining? You've had all of these legal issues. And that's exactly what they say at one point actually in this thing. So what did I put for that? Oh yes, I put a note here to talk about the differences between equality and equity because I feel like this is something that gets a bit misunderstood when people talk about it because I think it looks bad fundamentally to say that there should be unequal treatment now to address past inequalities because it looks like we should be operating according to principles of equal civil rights and such. And obviously, in the case of legal rights, I think that should be the case. But I think people aren't talking enough about the difference between equality and equity, which I define as everybody getting, say, the same treatment from the government, whereas equity would be about people getting treatment from the government or from social institutions necessary to contribute towards achieving an equal outcome in order to compensate for past inequalities. So, as an example, this morning I was watching a speech by Danel Peralta, who's a really interesting. Danel Padilla Peralta is a really interesting classics professor, and he made the argument that because there's all of these inequalities in publishing within classics, he says white scholars are going to have to publish less and cede those positions to minority people in order to improve that. Because there's currently this a vicious cycle in a way where white people have already been published so much. And if you've been published before, it's easy to keep getting published. So he's saying that journals and such need to make a choice to not not publish white people and to consciously promote scholars of color so that they can get in ahead. Similar issues happen in the US with don't they call it affirmative action and we call it positive discrimination? Yes.
Yes, they do. And that comes up here. Yes, for example, Harvard operates a policy against Chinese people. They operate a policy where they pretend that Chinese people are cruel and cold so that they can avoid giving them places, medical school and so on. But we'll come to that. We'll
Yes,
come
to be
to that
sure.
point shortly.
So that's what they're saying here is they're making the claim that only aggressive color conscious efforts will change the material circumstances. And I have mixed feelings about this. I'm not down on one side for sure either way. So this was a case study about a black lieutenant in the army, but we can skip past this, I think. Crits are suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. In our system, rights are almost always procedural, so the right to a fair process, rather than substantive, so a right to food, housing, or education. I think that's changing in some parts of the world. I think in Finland, they're making it so that the rights guaranteed in the constitution are more substantive. I think, for instance, the right to internet access and food and such like this in Finland, but I may be talking out my arse here. So what have I said to note for this? Yeah, I disagreed with this bit a little bit. So they said to think, for example, of speech that insults a judge or other authority figure that defames a wealthy and well-regarded person. They're saying that these kinds of speech aren't actually, they were claiming at least that these kinds of speech aren't actually protected. And I said, well, the problem is that they are in the US, to my knowledge, usually. So, I don't think that's fully true. And in Brown versus the Board of Education, yeah, this is a claim that they're making, that here, when they talk about how protest essentially dies down after a major decision like Brown versus the Board of Education, or like after Derek Chauvin got convicted. And they argue that afterwards people can just like slowly break away at the laws quietly behind the scenes and then take away those civil rights advantages. I think abortion rights in the US are probably the best example of this, with Roe versus Wade, and how after that there have been a slow reduction of a slow introduction of legal rulings and laws which restrict women's access to abortion, even if they don't entirely ban it. So we've gone over the critiques of liberalism. They're claiming that the critical race theory attacks on liberalism have softened a bit, because back in the past they were sort of at the forefront of opposing progressive change. Because most critical race theorists believe things are more complicated than a simple matter of opposing or supporting the matters of legal rights. Many of them have stopped focusing on liberalism and its ills and have begun to address the conservative tide, by which they mean like the backlash against it. Frankly, the conservative tide is in large part the people who did that, what was it, Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, when they were carrying tiki torches and saying Jews will not replace us, all of this charming stuff. So we're on now to structural determinism. The story about Eskimo languages, I put a note to say that that's not really true. It's a bit of a myth, but
It's a complete myth, and also the very word Eskimo is offensive to some Inuit. It was a term of abuse originally by some Native Americans. It means eater of raw fish. So I wouldn't personally have talked about Eskimo languages anyway. And you're quite right, they don't have 40 different words for snow. That's all nonsense.
I mean, English, you can make the argument, depending on how you define it, that English does, but
Yeah.
Yeah. I do find it a bit ironic that people writing a book on critical race theory would use Eskimo and not Inuit, but there you go.
I've raised my eyebrows at that.
So it's interesting what they say here about society only having one word, because I think this is definitely true, because when everything gets called racist, we don't differentiate between the degrees of racism. So a microaggression, I think, registers, the charge of a racist microaggression gets read in people's minds, similar to as if they have, I don't know, committed a hate crime or attacked somebody, or even denied them housing on the basis of their race. And because we don't have the terms to distinguish them, people will therefore overreact to a minor charge of racism and maybe underreact when somebody else is accused of a major charge, because they say, oh, well, I got accused of being racist for just not listening to a person of color on some issue or something like this. And that makes people less sympathetic to racist social policies. But then I feel that there's a double-edged sword here, where if too many terms get used, people tune out and they're like, I don't understand all of this jargon. What does any of this mean? But if only one term is used, then people don't have the language to talk about the specifics of what is admittedly a rather complicated issue.
But it's even worse than that, because the very term racism, it can mean different things in a broader sense. For example, what someone can believe in racism in the sense that they believe that different ethnicities have, for example, different levels of hormones or have inherent differences in cognitive ability. That's one meaning for the word racist. But you could feel that and still not display racial prejudice, still believe in just treatment and equal opportunity for everybody. It's a word that's scattered about. It's one that it unless you make it plain what you mean by racist, you're going to be in difficulty anyway.
Absolutely. And I was wondering if that, what you said there about believing that people have different like hormone levels, cognitive abilities, I wonder if that's what they mean by biological racism.
It's possible, yeah. I mean, scientific racism is a more common expression, but yeah, it could be that it might be biological racism.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking of is honestly, for me, it's the scariest statistic in regards to all of this is that doctors and nurses underestimate the amount of pain that the same injuries will cause for black patients relative to white patients, and
Yes,
that's
I've
just
heard that too. Yeah.
it's very chilling to think of that, and therefore they don't prescribe things like painkillers enough, which is
Mhm.
yeah, god awful. So maybe that's part of what they mean by it. But yes, so like this is what we just talked about. Our system is ill-equipped to address certain kinds of wrong, partly because there's not the language to talk about it.
Mhm.
That's very important. So this section is more about like the actual work of legal stuff, and so with legal matters like discovery, like trying to find past precedent and the law libraries, and it's essentially saying that law libraries have, as they are traditionally conceived, they're not well equipped to answer these things, especially because if an issue hasn't been focused on before, it may not be included in descriptions and things like this. But this is something and I think you as well, are less interested and familiar with, so we may skip past it because it's more specifically about law
Sure.
than about society. The empathetic fallacy I found was quite interesting. So this is discussing the idea that if a minority finds himself or herself on the receiving end of a stinging remark, the solution is not to punish the speaker or to enact some kind of campus hate speech rule, but urge the victim to speak back to the offender. And we often hear this rejoinder: the cure for bad speech is more speech, which I find interesting. I was wondering how you reacted to
I
this.
don't. It doesn't make any sense at all. No, I don't believe the cure for bad speech is to stop people speaking badly. I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the distinction for me is not, I guess, force them to not speak badly, to convince them not to speak badly, in the same way that we don't, I hope, force children to say that 2 plus 2 is 4. We
But
show
yes,
them.
the very fact you say that, Bella, in those terms tells me that you are an idealist. You're thinking, if we're talking about bad speech as somebody expressing negative views about people of colour, you think that you can persuade them or argue them out of the idea, and that if you can reason with them enough, they will adopt a different point of view. It's not so. In this case, a materialist to right. Unless you actually change the structure of society, those same ideas will persist. You can't if somebody hates black people, you can't possibly reason with them. It's not a reasonable belief. If somebody says, I don't like black people because, oh, they're all noisy or they're all dirty, that's not a reasonable belief. You can't persuade someone to stop holding a belief that's irrational. You can stop them speaking, you can make them stop saying the things like that, but you can't change their ideas and you can't persuade them to be different. Or all you can do is put a stop to it.
I don't know necessarily. Even, I just don't know, first of all, whether it's entirely rational or irrational, because somebody with bad evidence could come to a conclusion which is erroneous but still rational. So I'm just saying I'm agnostic on whether or not like racial prejudice is irrational. I don't know for sure, but also I guess I probably would agree that if it is irrational, we probably can't persuade people out of it. But I think the fact that online a lot of people do say that they have been persuaded out of believing racist, homophobic, transphobic beliefs by listening to content creators online, I feel like that is evidence that sometimes people can change out of these beliefs. Although the matter of irrationality is interesting because I often think a lot of these beliefs are more about social groups that people are in rather than necessarily an intellectual thing of I've read studies and therefore I believe that minorities have higher or lower cognitive abilities or whatever. I think for a lot of people it's about the groups that they are in and who makes them feel validated for expressing certain kinds of beliefs. And I think that's part of the reason why we're very interested in cancel culture in just like online discourse today, because I mean, cancel culture is a matter of group belonging, right? Saying that you do or do not belong in a group. And the fact that I think this is something that is gripping people's consciousness so much is, I think, very telling. This fear of being cast out of an online community seems very, very prominent in lots of people's minds. And I feel like that's maybe an indication that this is what's, at least, or at least the group relationships are very important in how somebody talks about their ideas, not just a rational, I've come to the facts on this matter. And that's part of why I try to do what I do with my channel. I'm trying to say that, hey, you know, even if I disagree with you or any other people in the comments, I'm not going to completely sort of cast you out, and therefore we can sort of stay in contact. And you don't need to have that as a fear in the back of your mind. But anyway,
You're an
I
essentially rational person, though. You deal with nice people. You deal with sensible and intelligent people. I think it might have given you a distorted view of the world, perhaps.
maybe. I mean, I've dealt with my share, to be sure, growing up in a church community. I've dealt with my share of people who, you know, maybe put more stock in miracles than I would like for a rational person, but it is what it is. We'll see. So yes, and so you're right, but I think I agree with you in that just convincing the person who says bad things isn't necessarily going to do very much, because there's loads of material barriers there, and also if they even if they stop saying things like with the homeless example they gave earlier, and that, say, the black person they called the N-word is still poor, like that's not going to help them that much if they, or that much more I should say, if they're still poor. They talk here about some of the circumstances in which it may be difficult for people to talk back, and I really like that they do this, because it's one of the things we don't consider enough, I think, is that people have different different access to free speech and the ability to speak out. Just because everyone has the legal right to speak, as a crude example, you know, some people have a megaphone, some people have literally, you know, news organizations to broadcast their free speech, and it's and so some people have different abilities to talk back, but also, like they say here, is that in some circumstances, if someone's been a bit racist towards you, it may be physically dangerous to talk back. Sorry, if you're in like at a rally and there are some fascists in a big group, you may not be able to say, because I've seen some of the what's the word, pie and mash people. I've seen videos of them attending protests, and they do look quite threatening. They even sort of get into scuffles with police, you know. So it might be dangerous to talk back directly there. And this is an interesting point. I don't know if I agree with it though. That much hate speech is not perceived as such at the time. I feel like this is a matter of, some of this is definitely true. Some of it's a matter of we weren't listening to people in the past who said that it was a problem, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, I've experienced just in my lifetime the terms for different parts of the trans community, some being now regarded as problematic, and that's not necessarily anyone's fault, if that makes sense. So this was an interesting question that they asked. How can one talk back to messages, scripts, and stereotypes that are embedded in the minds of one's fellow citizens and indeed the national psyche? I found that rather interesting.
Well, they're suggesting that society has to be revolutionized. They're suggesting that society must change in itself. It's not enough to stop using those things, because we do have stereotypes that are embedded deeply in us because of society, because we've grown up in a particular society. We do all think of Mexicans. We do have a vision of Mexicans with sombreros sleeping by a wall. It's something from cartoons. It's something from westerns. You know, it's there. It's been produced by society.
Yeah, I used to think when I was younger that there's no way people actually believe this stuff, but and it's I don't think it's that people believe that all Mexicans, for instance, always wear sombreros, but they certainly, I think that image is at the back of their mind when they're
And of
maybe.
course, yes, of course, here he takes the opposite case by saying something which is palpably untrue. Try explaining to someone who has never seen a Mexican except for cartoon figures wearing sombreros that most Mexicans wear business suits. Well, that's obviously untrue. Most Mexicans are women, aren't they? So does he mean most Mexican men wear business suits? That's not true anyway.
Well, yeah, yeah, that's why I put that in red. I was like, that's
Yeah.
I mean,
You only got to look at it if you look at the image of Mexico City. They're not mostly wearing business suits at all. That's absolute nonsense.
I mean, they're literally just like people. They're going to be wearing jeans and whatever the hell
Yeah,
they.
same as anybody else.
Yeah, I do. I do have to say, sometimes I feel like on the left there is this overcompensatory effort to write about minority groups in these overly glowing terms, when which don't just treat minority people as actually people. Um, I see this a lot with certain kinds of fake news. It's usually that there's a very specific script that goes along with it. It's like a surprisingly young person from a minority background has made some amazing development in science, and the claim is, in this like picture that they share on Facebook, the claim is that scientific institutions, because they're racist, are not giving credit. It's like some 15-year-old girl has discovered a cure for cancer, or blah blah blah.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that, particularly with American black young people. Yeah, it's quite true, actually.
And I mean, I think, frankly, it's just like overreaction and it's cringy as fuck. I do not like that. I see a few of my friends sharing these things very uncritically. And yeah, usually there's a slight grain of truth in some of these stories, but, it's not that much. I mean,
Yeah,
there was that case of that kid in the US, like Ahmed, didn't he? He was accused of making a bomb in school when it was like a clock, and people, you know, the kid, from what I understand, the kid was just trying to, what's the word? Be a bit. He was 13 years old, and he was trying to be
mm,
edgy and make a thing that looked like a bomb. Cool,
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
But people were blowing him up as like, oh, this is like a genius kid who's going to like, who built a clock or whatever, and he got, I think he got offers of scholarships and stuff, which cool, good for him. He can become a scientist, but it's a bit over exaggerated. But I think it's important to think about why people do this as well. I think people do this less out of a concern for minorities, because with the case of making up some story about a brilliant black scientist who's not been recognized, that doesn't help anyone because there's no actual black scientist who's done the thing to be recognized. Or if there is, it's if it's based on a real achievement, then the thing is very much less impressive than what the story claims, and therefore the person isn't going to get that much of a benefit from it anyway. I think it's done to virtue signal mostly to other liberal white people online.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I mean, I attack this stuff, I guess, from a critical race theory perspective, being like, this is, and from an anti-racist perspective, being, you're not helping at all with this. And at this point, actually, in the case, in this case excerpt that they gave, I found really, I honestly just hadn't thought about it. Breaking up families by sending fathers and mothers to prison for unnecessarily long terms sows the seeds of problems for the next generation. Because I was like, well, yeah, actually, that's something I truly hadn't considered. That de facto, when you sentence somebody, their family are penalized for it as well to varying degrees. But in the case of parents being sentenced to prison sentences, that does really like negatively impact their child, and the child, of course, being completely innocent in that. I was like, that's really interesting.
Well, you've got to bear in mind also that 1 in 3 black American men will spend time in prison. The average African American man is more likely to go to prison than he is university. So it has a huge effect upon an awful lot of children.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons I hate the stereotype I hear from the right wing online of where are the fathers in black communities, when if a lot of the times fathers are being locked up disproportionately or just given disproportionately long prison sentences, it's not entirely their own fault that they're not there with the children. And I believe there's actually research looking into black fatherhood showing that black fathers do more of the like fathering things, like reading with their children and taking them to events and such, than white fathers do on average. Not massively more, but more. And I found that interesting. That was a study, if I'm remembering it correctly, based in the US. We won't do the classroom exercise, I think, because we're not law students. but I did find the question. Wait, is this the one? No, there was a question below about yeah, this one about Aziz being about a person being put on the no-fly list, and they're essentially saying that this is an opportunity for you as a lawyer to attack the inequalities in who gets put on the no-fly list. And they're asking, should you take the case even though your client mostly just wants to get himself off the list? I found that interesting. I mean, I don't know as a lawyer because I'm not sorry because I'm not a lawyer. Like, what should be done there? But it's an interesting question. So I think we're close to the end now. Some critics, such as Derek Bell and Alan Freeman, even argue that our system of civil rights law and enforcement ensures that racial progress occurs at just the right slow pace. I didn't like this. It feels like it's claiming that, judges and politicians are getting together in a smoky room and they're like, right, we're evil and we want to keep just as much racism as possible. So we're going to give them these little crumbs at exactly the right point to keep things slow. It just seems, I don't know. I don't like this claim.
It sounds plausible to me, really.
Yeah. You don't need bad actors in a system. You don't need bad apples in a bad barrel, kind of thing. And here's another one: the costs of that concession. So the concession of a civil rights case victory, which Brown versus the Board of Education. So the costs of that concession are always placed on minorities in the form of stigma, and I don't like that either because that's criticized. The stigma is not coming from the legal system. The stigma is coming from outside of the legal system. So bringing that up as a critique of the legal decision, I feel, is problematic. But also the cost of it are always placed on minorities or on working class whites like Adam Backey. And I mean, sure, I probably is true, but working class people of any group are going to probably suffer most from the majority of legal decisions because they have the least resources. It's quite... I feel like that's not a specific thing. I wasn't fond of their argument here. I mean, to be fair, they're not arguing this. They're just saying that some people like Derek Bell and Aaron Friedman do argue this. So, and that this is the last case example they gave. They gave a case of a ninth grade daughter, going to a class where they were being called racial slurs and they had terrible graffiti written on the walls and such. And I think in this case the mother sued because she argued that the school was not doing enough to create an environment where the child was able to learn without this psychological barrier. And while I absolutely agree that this is a terrible sort of psychological burden for the child, I feel like I agree with the suit, but my issue with the phrasing is that it looks like people are going to say that there's not that much the school itself can do about this. Do you know what I mean? People will say that, yeah, they can't stop students from being racist. And then maybe they would need an idealist perspective to come in and say, well, let's educate the students correctly. These are some questions for students, but again, we're not law students, so we're not going to go over that. And yeah, we've come to the end. Did you have any overall thoughts, I suppose, for this second chapter?
No, my overall thoughts really concern critical race theory itself. A lot of people, particularly white people, tend to see it as something which is just trying to abolish racism. They see it as an anti-racist movement. And they think in terms of if racism could be abolished and people could think differently, then that would be fine. There'd be no need for critical race theory or anti-racism. I don't think everybody realizes that critical race theory is actually trying to revolutionize society, that they're actually a Marxist movement, that they want to change the conditions of life for everybody. They want to change society. And I think that's an important point for people to realize.
Yeah, well, I think they are, definitely. I don't know if they're saying openly that they are Marxists, but...
They don't need to. Anything that talks about the opposing views of idealism and materialism is Marxist.
Yeah.
This is straight out the German ideology, Marx and Engels.
Well, to be sure. I mean, I'm sort of sympathetic to a lot of Marxist ideas, so that's not necessarily a problem for me.
No,
Partly
I'm not
because...
criticizing. I'm
Yeah,
saying that I don't think everybody realizes that that is the case. I'm not saying whether or not
right,
they're right or wrong to hold those views.
right.
A lot of people don't seem to realize that is behind a lot of what looks like straightforward anti-racism these days.
Well, I think it's because of like intersectionality, like they said above, that people realize that you can't just address racism, sexism, queerphobia in isolation, because in large part because these negative outcomes for minority groups are a product of systemic forces which aren't going to go away if everybody simply reduces their prejudice or loses their prejudices. And partly, I think an important thing to mention is that a lot of these prejudices get expressed through inequality. An unequal outcome at the end of the day is literally an unequal outcome in people having less. To use the Martin Luther King, to use the Martin Luther King argument, Black Americans have been denied, if we were to have taken the lost wages that they had compounded with interest, they've lost billions, over the course of history in the US. That's a material loss that means that Black families today have so much less wealth than white families in the US. So I think a lot of these inequalities do get expressed in terms of wealth. So approaching it through a Marxist perspective, I think it makes much more sense than to approach it without a Marxist or
But
without being informed.
yeah, but by quality of outcome. So, I mean, at the moment, something like 10% of A-level students, of white A-level students in Britain, get 3 A's or better at A-level, whereas it's just over 5% for black students. Are you saying that the system should be changed so that both black and white students both get the same percentage of top grades at A level? That would be equality of outcome, wouldn't it?
So I think when people talk about equality of outcome, it sounds like we're saying just go in and change the grades of black students, even if they didn't deserve it, to bump them up. And that's not what I at least advocate for. Like, I think that what should happen is what has been happening for the last few decades in more educational investment being directed specifically at the issues that minority students face in order to help them go through the education system more effectively and improve
What do
their
you mean by
grades.
minority students? Sorry.
So students of like black and minority ethnic backgrounds, I'd
But
say.
that's no. Chinese students get twice as many top A levels as white students. So you're talking specifically about helping black people rather than minorities as such, are you?
Yeah, black people, and from what I remember, these efforts are often targeted also at Bangladeshi students, for instance, and Roma students who have specific educational needs. So it's not like, yeah, it's not all minority students who are going to need this kind of focus from educators, but giving focus to the groups that need it seems to be a good thing, which is why I haven't read it to clarify, but the latest Sauer report in education, I think, showed that, he claimed at least, that racial differences, from my having read the news article, he claimed that racial differences had become less important than class differences within education. And I remember this being true from doing A-level sociology, that differences between the genders has improved a bit in terms of schooling. Boys are catching up a bit, or girls caught up and have now exceeded. Now the matter is getting boys to catch up. Racial groups have been doing better with targeted, so like Afro-Caribbeans and Bangladeshi students, to my knowledge, have over time been starting to do better relatively in school and catching up. But poor people are not catching up to middle class people at all. Like, it's like the chart goes up like that. And so there's a real issue there. Maybe because at the end of the day, the material conditions and class conditions do just provide a barrier that is difficult to address and difficult to overcome
So
within the education.
so ideally, you would think it would be the case that that the Chinese students, the students of East Asian origin, would only be getting 10% of top grades, and so would black students, and so would white students, so that every ethnicity and every class would be getting the same proportion of top grades at A level. Is that right?
No, no. I'm saying that we should, if we identify that some groups are proportionately underperforming, we should invest in invest in programs and such lot that aim to improve their outcomes in order to help them to catch up.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You actually feel it would be desirable, a desirable outcome, if all ethnicities and all classes got roughly the same proportion of top grades as A level. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, obviously, we'd have to mark Chinese students more harshly. You'd have to
No,
reduce. No, it's not. I'm serious, Bella, because that's exactly what Harvard is doing. Harvard are artificially limiting the intake of East Asian students because there are too many of them, or they feel there's too many. So they work a quota system there
yeah,
because
no, no.
they don't want too many Chinese people to go to Harvard.
And for the record, I don't agree with that. And that's why what I was saying is not at the level, say, of the exam to mark minority students lighter or harsher or whatever. It would be like before the exam to give them as many opportunities to do as well as possible, so that among the cohort of each ethnic group, the ones who, let's say, have the potential to do well, have the greatest opportunities to live and fulfill their expectations. Sorry, to fulfill their potential. That's all I'm
Yeah.
saying.
The problem is though that when you do something like that targeted at general improvement, the black students certainly do better, but so do white students. You get it with the American No Child Left Behind legislation. It increased black achievement, but white achievement increased even more. It's a very tricky situation.
Well, from what
Maybe
I
we ought to devote ourselves perhaps to a discussion of this at some point.
Yeah, I would need to do some reading to prepare for a discussion on education policy specifically. But from what I remember, like educational achievement in terms of the number of A levels and A to C's, the GCSE, has been improving for minority communities which have had that specific targeting. Mostly it's like been Afro-Caribbeans and students of Pakistani, Bangladeshi origin who've received this targeted provision within the public school system in the UK. And it seems to be that these students have been improving in their proportion and catching up to white people. And I do need to read the Sowell report on equalities in education, because he claimed now that the class differences are more important than racial differences in education, which is an interesting claim. I'd have a look at the data for it. I'm going to cop to ignorance. And with my cop to ignorance, which I'm sure will be derided in the comment section, I think we can come to an end here. This was interesting going through it. I'm just going to have a poke at the headlines to see what the next chapter is going to be about, because I'm curious. And it is going to be, they got a list of selected readings as well. So if anyone watching wants to pause the screen and go and have a read of some of these, if you have access to them, that would be I would encourage you to do that if you're interested in pursuing any of these subjects more. Legal storytelling and narrative analysis. That's very interesting. Okay.
Interesting.
Nice. As a literature student, I'm going to have a good time with this. So thank you so much, Simon, for coming on and doing this. Guys, let me know in the comment section what you think. I'm going to leave a link to my Middle English Manuscript Discord server if anyone wants to come and join in the discussion. Link will be in the comments below. We have people coming in and ask questions about the chapters and about the readings. So I'll try to answer as best I can. I'm not a lawyer or anything, but I'll try to answer as best I can to my understanding of critical race theory. And thank you guys for watching. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.
Bye.